Greetings. My name is Kate Rademacher, and I'm here with Writing for Your Life and Compassionate Christianity. I'm really delighted that we're here with Jeff Crosby, who's been an amazing friend to Writing for Your Life and Compassionate Christianity since their inception. Jeff's been a fabulous sort of colleague and mentor, I'd say, for both Brian, Elaine, and myself. So thank you. Thank you, Jeff, for all you do. And we're also here to talk about your new book, which is amazing. And I've really been privileged to get an advance copy. I know it's coming out soon. The title of the book is The Language of the Soul, Meeting God in the Longings of Our Hearts. What an amazing title and subtitle. So I want to jump right on in and, but just briefly to say, for those of you who aren't familiar with Jeff, let me just pull up your bio. So for those of you who don't know Jeff is the president of the industry organization ECPA, and he's been a publisher with InterVarsity. He was an executive director of the Association of Logos Bookstores and served as vice president of sales with Ingram Book Company in Nashville. So he's just got an extensive experience from the publishing industry side, and we are going to hear from him today about his work as an author. And also, clearly you are a lover of music, Jeff, so maybe that's a good place to start. Can you tell us perhaps what I'd really like to start is what we were talking about before the recording started, but this amazing word that you use in your book. Can you pronounce it for me? I know it's Portuguese. Can you pronounce it and tell us a little bit about the word that I'm referring to?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me, Kate. It's a privilege to be here with you. The word Kate is talking about is a Portuguese word, as she said. It's pronounced saudagi, and it came to me through music. It came to me through music coming out of Brazil, bossa nova music, samba, jazz, artists like João Gilberto and Ivan Lins and Yo-Yo Ma and many others. And probably 25, 30 years ago, I first encountered it on jazz records. And I just wondered, what does that word mean? It was on just about every Stan Getz record or others. It was, and I wanted to know what it meant. I'm a lover of words, and I have curiosity. Whenever I bump into a word, I don't know what it means. I can't just read over it, whether it's on an LP cover or in a book. And so that started this quest, which is decades old now, but in earnest about 15 years ago, as Google opened up and library databases opened up the ability to dig deeper into saudagi. So yeah, very much rooted in music, this book. And I believe in the introduction that while I've worked in the world of books all of my adult life, music is the language of my soul. And so it is.
That's amazing. So you were introduced to this word through music, and can you just summarize for our listeners and those viewing what it means? It was so interesting. It sounds like it's pretty difficult to pin down the definition. I read at one point that you said some view it as an untranslatable word. So I know this is a tough task, but maybe you can summarize how at least you understand it.
Yeah, I think the English-speaking world has likened it to longing. And in some of the songs that I'm referring to, and some of the songs, and indeed the playlist and the introduction of the book will parenthetically say longing. So it doesn't quite capture the depth of the word saudagi, but it's the best English equivalent. A lot of linguists call saudagi an untranslatable emotion. And yet longing is what approximates it for English-speaking people.
Well, I felt kind of emotional reading about this sort of, word and concept that sort of almost lacks definition, full concrete definition. And it was interesting to read how other people, your friends and colleagues, get emotional about this concept as well. And maybe that's a good tie to just, you talk a lot about longings in your book. And I think you articulate 10 different longings, both interior, interior, external, and then longings of heaven, I think, is the third category, right? So can you just talk more about this idea of longings and how sort of this theme came to you through the course of your life?
Yeah, so as the study on saudagi deepened, as I continued to listen to music and then began to read books that at least had the word in the title. Oftentimes they would, they use the word in the title, but they were really travel logs of going to Portugal or places in South America. And they weren't diving into the word at all. But there are a few books out there that began to get at it, and some articles and things like that. I remember sometime around 2008 taking the rudiments of the book proposal. Of course, working at InterVarsity Press for nearly a quarter century, I knew what a good book proposal looked like. I knew what it had to have. And the person that I went to when I was first writing what was becoming a book proposal in 2008 was Phyllis Tickle. Phyllis is a name that probably most of your listeners, Kate, would know. She was a longtime religion editor of Publishers Weekly, wrote a dozen or more books herself, including editing The Divine Hours. And Phyllis was a dear friend of my wife's and mine, and someone that I felt I could risk going to with this very early version of a book proposal. And she was so encouraging about it. She said, I wondered how long it would take you to write about that. I had talked to her about saudagi before. She said, I wondered how long it would take you to get around to finally writing it. Now just go do it. That was 2008. So it took me a long time to get from point A to point B. But Phyllis was a person along the way who really kind of watered this seed. And then I worked at IVP with a gentleman from Brazil. He's not from one of the large cities in that country, but a smaller city, had lived there all of his young life. I wanted to know what he thought. So one day he was in my office and I said, Joaquin, I want to say a word to you. And I want to know, what does it mean to you? So I said, saudagi. And tears welled up in Joaquin's eyes. And he said, you know that word? It is such a rich word. I'm so glad you know the word. And thus began many years ago a conversation partner. Joaquin became a conversation partner. And we talked a lot about what it meant. He likened it to what some of your readers may know as the story of the two people. We don't know exactly who they were, but on the road to Emmaus after the crucifixion narrative in the New Testament. And he said, I believe what those two people felt in their hearts was saudagi. And oh my goodness, it told me how much I look through books and even sacred texts through a decidedly American eyes, because that had never occurred to me, linking the road to Emmaus story and this word that meant so much to me. But Joaquin brought that out. And so he also watered, and other books, other writers, many of whom make appearances in the book, like Howard Thurman, the great civil rights leader, or Frederick Buechner, or Maya Angelou, many others. So the work that I was doing in publishing also watered these seeds, and eventually came to the point where I had enough of it written that I was willing to risk sending it out to a half dozen publishers. And thankfully, a few of them said yes, and Broadleaf is the publisher that is bringing it out on Tuesday of next week.
So exciting. Well, I can't wait. I was telling Jeff before we started that I've already given my copy away. I got a free copy, so I had to order myself a new copy for myself. So your writing is both beautiful and accessible, and just really enjoyed it. So, and it's not just your beautiful words that are important to this book. I think what's really interesting is also the way music plays a very central role in this book. And so maybe you can just describe to our listeners what these playlists are. It seems like, at the end of every chapter, you have a playlist, and I've never seen that in a book. So can you just talk, maybe I'm just behind the times, so I think it was really cool. So can you just talk a little bit about how that came to be, and a little bit more for those who haven't seen the book yet, how these playlists kind of complement the content of each chapter?
Yeah. So at the end of each chapter, as Kate was saying, there is a list of 6. So a playlist for the opening chapter, The Longing for Home, for example, it'll have 6 songs that tie into that theme, either directly or indirectly. I believe that chapter, yeah, it starts with Simon and Garfunkel. I'm a late baby boomer, and so there are quite a few things from the 60s and 70s and early 80s, but I did try to sprinkle in all the way up to the present day songs that have impacted me around these 10 themes. As Kate was saying, there are 10 chapters, each of them a longing for. The book begins with a longing for home, and it ends with a longing for heaven. And in between, there are 8 others: a longing for friendship, forgiveness, spiritual transformation, freedom from fear and anxiety, and others. So, as an example, the playlist for A Longing for Home starts with My Little Town by Simon and Garfunkel. The Longing for Home by Cherish the Ladies, more of a bluegrass recording. A song by a friend of mine named Brooks Williams, a folk artist, called Rail Walker. And that ties in not so much directly to the idea of home, but I tell the story in the chapter A Longing for Home about walking this railroad track as a kid, and walking a couple of miles down to an old wooden trestle or a bridge that spanned the Sugar Creek in the little town that I grew up in, population 250 souls on a good year. And so this Rail Walker song fits a part of the chapter, one of the stories that I tell. A song called Home by Rich Mullins, which is a powerful work on it. St. Judy's Comet by Kenny Loggins. It's a song written by Paul Simon, but popularized by Kenny Loggins. And then more recently, a San Diego and Hawaii artist that I love named Jack Johnson, again, a song called Home. So all of the songs in the playlist meant something to me personally, and either thematically tie into the chapter or are directly speaking to the longing for home that we all carry within our souls, whether we are attentive to that or not. And it actually came about as a result of my editor. Her name is Lil Copan. She is an extraordinary acquisitions editor with Broadleaf, and she was the editor of my wife's second book that was published with Paraclete, called By Willoway Brook. And my wife had told me, when I was thinking, who do I send this out to, said, well, I can just tell you, the editor that made my books better than any others was Lil Copan. And so I was grateful that Lil, in the midst of the developmental process, she said, as I read this, I am hearing the need for a playlist. Do you think, and this was very late in the game, she said, do you think you could assemble a playlist for each chapter? And I said, well, I think I could do that for you in about an hour. And I just sat down and assembled the list in my head, and then I did research to make sure that all or most of them are on streaming services like Spotify and Pandora. I think there are only 2 that weren't, but they're on YouTube. So all of the songs, you can readily find, and you can listen as you read that chapter if you so desire. Everything from worship songs from the Taizé community in France to George Harrison, Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth, and lots of things in between.
That's great. Is there literally a shareable playlist on Spotify that I can?
There is. So I created one, and it's called The Language of the Soul, a Musical Mix. And that has 66 songs. So yes, you could call that up and add it to your library and make it easy for you to find it. And they're sorted in the order in which they appear in the book.
Wow, that's awesome. All right, well, I'm going to go get it right after this. So
Okay.
Thanks for making it easy for us. So you mentioned one of the longings is freedom of fear of anxiety. And from our other conversations, I'm personally in a big time of change and upheaval, exciting, but also scary. So can you just tell us a little bit more about that chapter? Because I know so many of us are feeling kind of anxious these days. And also before we started the recording, we were talking about the concept of courageous compassion. So I'm just wondering if you can, maybe if you see any linkages there, I'd love to hear those as well.
Yeah, that chapter opens with a scene from the American Booksellers Association convention at the Jacob Javits Center in New York City. This was, for many years, it was the second largest gathering of publishing industry people in the world after the Frankfurt Book Fair. And it's probably the most vulnerable chapter in the book for me. It's one that I wasn't sure I wanted to write on. I wasn't sure once I got into it that I wanted it to see the light of day, because what the chapter details is in 1988, I'm sitting and listening to an author who is deceased now, but who meant a great deal to me. His name is Gerald May. He had written a book called Addiction and Grace that was published by Harper San Francisco. And it was a very large gathering in a ballroom of, I believe, a Hilton hotel in New York City. And I was trying to listen to him even as I watched the environment in which I was in, where we were all merrily tipping our glasses of wine, and having our conversations while he is talking to us about addiction and grace. And there was something in what at the time, it wouldn't today, but at the time it felt like the incongruity between his message in his book and in his lecture and the environment and my own story of my family of origin related to alcoholism. And I experienced what I later knew to be a panic attack. I had never experienced it before. I have since, but thankfully, it is not a routine part of my life. But in 1988, I simply didn't know what to do with it, and I felt the walls were caving in. It was all the hallmarks. If you looked at the classical definitions of a panic attack, I had them, but I didn't have a vocabulary. Thankfully, my wife Cindy was with me, and I just turned to her and I said, I have to get out of here. The walls are closing in. And you talk about, courageous compassion. She had courageous compassion on me that night. We were only 24 years old. We were young kids. We owned a bookstore in Bloomington, Indiana. And she walked with me as I ran. She walked behind me. We caught a cab in New York City in the rain, and we went to wherever we were staying. It was kind of a budget hotel somewhere in Manhattan. And the next day, after spending the night kind of decompressing and talking about what happened, what was going on, and I literally didn't know, we blew off the next day's work at the Javits Center, and we went to the lower end of Manhattan where the trade towers used to stand, and we got on a ferry and we went to Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. And throughout that experience, she and I processed what had happened. I remember going to a record store when we got back on land in Lower Manhattan, and I sought out John Lennon's album Imagine. And why did I do that? And why do I remember that I did that? I had a Walkman. I bought the cassette of Imagine, and I just listened to that title song on repeat. Imagine there's no heaven, no hell below us. And somehow, this anthem from 1971 gave me solace and helped point me back. So that is the sort of literary device, as vulnerable as that feels, to let that out in the world, as I began to unpack the longing for freedom from fear and anxiety. And I think in terms of what you're attempting to do, what those of us in that courageous compassion community are doing is helping other people like I was in 1988, who for whatever reason and whatever context are struggling with their environment. It may not be a panic attack. It could be another mental health concern, or the church, or many other things. I think being present for each other in the way that thankfully Cindy was present for me that day in New York City, if people read that chapter and either are attentive to their own longing for freedom in this realm, or know someone else who is clearly still struggling, even though the pandemic looks like it's over. I think the effects of it, if not the pandemic itself, are certainly still with a lot of us. There's tremendous anxiety and fear. And I just came back from Poland, event in Krakow, not far from the Ukraine border, where ECPA gathered up publishers from mostly Eastern Europe, other parts of the world as well, Colombia, the UK, Scotland, and elsewhere. And just speaking with people in Eastern Europe, Christian publishers who have been so devastated, so impacted by this unjust war in Ukraine, and the fear, the worry, the anxiety was palpable, but so was the hope. And so I think that's what that community that you and Brian before you have drawn together is trying to attend to.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you for sharing, that really personal story. As someone who has a history of clinical anxiety, I really relate to that. The fear of the fear, and the confusion about things, the confusion about what's going on. And I'm just reflecting on how as we're recording this, it's May, and that's Mental Health Awareness Month. And again, so many of us have family and friends and colleagues who have struggles with mental health issues that have only, of course, oftentimes gotten worse and more intense during the recent pandemic. So I'm just curious, how do you feel like your book, sort of, especially this idea of longings, how do you think sort of getting in touch with our longings can help be sort of help with the language of the soul, as you say? Like, how is that helpful? I mean, if there's this poignancy and this almost painfulness of our longings, as you described in the introduction, the sort of just the emotionality of like what's the spiritual benefit of really getting in touch with those longings?
In his book, The Holy Longing, published a number of years ago, the writer Ronald Rolheiser, he talks about our longings or our desires, both the pain and the hope of them, the pain and the joy. He says that is our spirituality. So yes, you're wise to recognize, Kate, that a longing carries with it both sides of that coin: pain and hope, pain and joy. And I believe that we are all, as human persons, we are hardwired with longing. And we're all of us made in the image of God. It's just a part of our DNA, and we are driven to some extent. We are driven by these longings, by these desires, whether we know it or not. And so I believe that being attentive to our longings, and for me, journaling is probably the most significant Christian practice that I have had to attempt to be attentive to them. Other things such as reading the Psalms, practicing the divine hours, the Ignatian Examen, all of which I talk about in different chapters of the book. Those have been practices through which I have tended to these longings. And if we just continue, there's a writer who talks in leadership circles about the difference between a speedboat and a sailboat. And Dallas Willard used to, any of us who would sit and listen to him at events that we did with Renovari together, the ruthless elimination of hurry and all of that I've taken in through years and years of publishing these voices. Now, I would say, as I've gotten older, as I've dived more deeply into the spiritual practices, I recognize that tending to the longing, not in a hurried and harried kind of way, but in a very slow, disciplined, daily, to the extent that I can, way. It helps a lot of other things. One of the chapters is a longing for an undivided life, which is informed by the work of Parker Palmer, and I so appreciate his work, and have found that leaning into this attentiveness, it helps me heal the divided life, that the on stage, off stage, or on stage, backstage kind of dichotomy that is, if we're not careful, is very much a part of who we are. So longings bring hope, longings bring pain. They drive us. Being attentive to them helps shape it toward a joy, helps us shape it toward a healing, toward a hopefulness, as opposed to a painful, despairing kind of way. And so a lot of people have asked me, what do I hope people will gain by reading these pages? And it is to befriend our longings, and to see them not as something to fear or ignore, but rather something to befriend and tend to, and to invite God into the midst of them. And I believe that God is there all along, whether we invite or not. But so that is my hope.
Well, thank you for that. And I think it's such a good message, because it's so tempting for me, at least, to sort of run away from my longings, because I think, oh, well, it's not feasible, or it maybe isn't even spiritual. I sort of wrestle with my longings. So I think that word befriend is a good one. And, you beat me to it. I was going to ask sort of, what are your hopes? But, more actually, I'm just curious if you can speak. You have such an amazing position as both a writer and a publishing expert, truly. I mean, you've seen it all. Not
Yeah.
all, you've been around, and so, from the perspective of sort of the, I don't know, the dialogue that's happening in the US and globally right now, where do you sort of hope that this book will land?
Oh my, I think being in the business, Kate, it'll be 40 years in September of 2023. I think it has given me a very, very realistic view about books and publishing and writing. So thankfully, I don't feel, at least not yet, I haven't felt any anxiety whatsoever about, is the book going to sell? Will it stay in print? All of that. I think knowing the business so well, and having such a realistic view, it has removed a lot of anxiety that authors feel. I headed up sales and marketing at InterVarsity Press for 19 years before I became publisher. And so my work was directly related to helping launch books, help make them known, getting authors in front of media and so forth. And there's a lot of anxiety associated with that. So I'm thankful that being in the business as long as I have, so it sort of evened that out. I'm going to work as hard as I can. I'm going to partner with Broadleaf Books as well as I can, and I'm going to, I'll call in favors of industry friends and authors in appropriate ways. But my hope is that the book will speak into conversations here in the U.S., but also around the world. I intentionally, though there are obviously a few scenes from my childhood that is located in Middle America, I tried to utilize language that would go beyond barriers of geography. And so I do hope that in the English speaking world that it will start conversations about desire. One person called the book a theology of desire. I don't necessarily see it quite that way. I think of a theology of desire being a little bit more academic, a little bit headier. but perhaps a pastoral theology, that I could go for something like that. Just helping people who maybe were raised. I was not raised in the church, so I didn't have the baggage of is any longing and desire not leading us down a narcissistic, selfish, kind of path. I didn't carry that sort of baggage to the extent that I know a lot of people have who were raised in an ultra conservative kind of environment. But I am aware that that is out there, and I hope that this book will be an invitation to people who maybe have been confused about when you say being attentive or befriending your longings, or you're not saying anything goes. And that's not the case. In the book, I do invite the reader to be aware of whether or not the longing is drawing one closer to God and to God's ways in the world, or is it taking us further afield? So yeah, I hope it will stimulate individual reflection, some group study, and I know that that's happening in my own church. I'm very thankful for that, and hopefully it'll go beyond that. Some soul care podcasts and book clubs I know are using it. So for individual and group reflection, but also in the global context of which I have been a part of the Christian publishing scene in New Zealand and Australia and the UK and elsewhere for a long time.
Well, thank you so much. Again, it's such a beautiful book, and I'm super excited to hear that there is a playlist. So yes, please hold up the book so we can see it. We're videoing this too. Jeff Crosby's book, The Language of the Soul, Meeting God and the Longing of Our Hearts. Really just, I like what you just said about pastoral theology, because the word that kept coming, the combination of words that kept coming to mind as I was reading, was beautifully written and also accessible. And so I think that sort of pastoral tone is really evident. I felt some just, I don't know, comfort, encouragement as I was reading it. So I really appreciate the voice. And can you tell us where we can get the book?
Well, any bookstore now could order it. It's already in the distribution pipeline. The official launch date is Tuesday, the 23rd of May, but as so often happens, whenever the behemoth online retailer out in Seattle, Washington, when they have it, it means it's official and everyone else could order it for you. So christianbook.com, your local bookseller, Amazon, on my website, jeffreycrosby.net. There are some links of where you can get it through independent stores. As a former independent bookstore owner, my heart is still very much with them, even though I know a lot of communities don't have a store. So, but you could look on the site and you could find a link where you could order it from a local store. So I encourage that as well. But it is available even in advance of its launch date.
Great. Well, just to make things really hard as we wrap up, I'm going to ask you to pick your favorite song in the book. So you have all these playlists at the end of each chapter. If you had to pick one song, or maybe it varies by your mood, what would you put on right now after this interview? What would you listen to from the playlist?
Oh my goodness, that is so hard. But in the chapter on, you should have told me you were going to do that ahead of time. I'm going to go for a playlist from The Longing for Community. When I was growing up, there was a Chicago area gospel group called the Staple Singers. And they had a number of hits on a Memphis label called Stax. Things like I'll Take You There and Let's Do It Again. But Mavis Staples, who was a daughter in the Staples Singers back in the day, she did a solo recording in 2010. The recording is called You Are Not Alone, and the song that's on the playlist is You Are Not Alone. This is in the chapter, The Longing for Community. It could also have been in the playlist for The Longing for Freedom from Fear and Anxiety, but a beautiful song where she recounts for those who maybe feel that they're alone, who feel they are on the margins, who feel that they are misunderstood. A beautiful song of hope and affirmation telling the listener you're not alone.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. And just for those final words too. I mean, I think many of us are longing for community, and I'm really blessed to be in community with you
Likewise.
as a colleague and really as a beneficiary of your beautiful words. So congratulations on this book launch. Can you hold it up one more time?
I would be happy to.
Our beautiful book, The Language of the Soul. And you can check out the mix on Spotify, The Language of the Soul, a musical mix. And there's Jeff's book, and check it out. Really wonderful. And thank you again, Jeff, for being with us.
Thank you, Kate. Take care.
Take care.